What if the deal Washington is calling a historic breakthrough was never designed to work in the first place? What if the people who signed it in Washington already knew, deep down, that the one group with the power to say no was never going to say yes? Before we go any further, if you want to actually understand what's happening in the Middle East, instead of just watching headlines fly past you, hit subscribe right now and tap that notification bell, because this channel breaks down the parts of the story nobody else is explaining. And you don't want to miss the next one. All right, let's get into it. On June 26, 2026, 3 governments sat down and signed something they called a framework for peace. The United States, Israel, Lebanon. 14 points. A stack of paper that was supposed to pull Lebanon permanently out of Iran's orbit and end the era of Hezbollah as an armed force inside its own country. Officials called it historic. Diplomats called it a turning point. And for about a week, the story that dominated every major outlet was simple. America had done it again. Another Middle Eastern nation was being peeled away from its old alliances, just like Egypt was in 1978. But something strange happened right after the ink dried. Hezbollah didn't fold. They didn't even negotiate. Within minutes of the signing ceremony being announced, a Hezbollah member of parliament stood up and called the entire agreement an act of betrayal. He said the group would hold onto its weapons tighter than at any point in its history. Not looser, tighter. And, a few days later, Iran's own negotiators, sitting in Doha for talks with the Trump administration, refused to even sit in the same room as the American envoys. They let every single message pass through Qatari mediators instead, like they were speaking to Washington through a wall. Here's the question nobody in the mainstream coverage seems to be asking. If this deal really works the way it's being sold, why is Iran acting like it already knows the outcome? Why does Tehran seem completely unbothered? Why is Hezbollah, a group that just went through one of the most brutal wars in its history, suddenly speaking with more confidence, not less? I think the answer is uncomfortable for a lot of people watching this unfold, because I think Iran already saw through the entire plan, not after it was signed, before. And what's happening right now in Beirut, in Doha, and in the waters around the Strait of Hormuz isn't 3 unrelated news stories. It's Iran quietly showing the world that America built a deal on a foundation that was never going to hold, and doing it in a way that lets everyone watch it collapse in real time. Let's start with the history, because you cannot understand why this deal is fragile without understanding the deal it was copied from. In 1978, the United States pulled off one of the most impressive diplomatic maneuvers of the entire Cold War. Egypt was the anchor of the Arab world at the time, aligned with the Soviet Union, leading the Arab coalition against Israel. Washington made President Sadat an offer he genuinely could not refuse. Israel would return the entire Sinai Peninsula, not a slice of it, all of it, along with billions of dollars. An annual aid flowing to Cairo every year going forward. Sadat took the deal. Egypt signed peace with Israel, and almost overnight, the unified Arab front against Israel cracked apart, and the Soviet Union lost its most important ally in the region. That single agreement reshaped the entire balance of power in the Middle East for the next 4 decades. It worked because of one very specific structural reality. Sadat commanded the Egyptian military directly. When he decided the Soviets were out and peace with Israel was in, the army followed him. There was no internal rival power with its own weapons, its own parliament seats, its own hospitals and schools, capable of standing up and saying no. Egypt was a single unified state with a single chain of command, and that chain of command belonged to one man. Now look at what Washington is trying to do with Lebanon in 2026, using almost the exact same financial formula. Hundreds of millions of dollars in humanitarian aid, direct reimbursement to the Lebanese armed forces, a promise of American-led reconstruction, a phased Israeli withdrawal from the south. And in exchange, Lebanon is supposed to disarm Hezbollah and declare that no outside force, meaning Iran, can use violence on Lebanese soil without the government's direct approval. On paper, it looks identical to Camp David. In practice, it's built on a completely different foundation, and that foundation is cracked before it's even finished setting. Hezbollah is not a foreign army stationed on Lebanese land. That's the entire misunderstanding baked into this framework. Hezbollah is Lebanon in the sense that it has grown so deeply into the country's political and social structure that you cannot surgically remove it without tearing apart everything around it. They hold seats in parliament. They run hospitals that treat ordinary Lebanese families who have nowhere else to go. They operate schools. They've built decades of relationships in communities across the south and the Bekaa Valley that the central government in Beirut has never been able to replicate. And on top of the politics and the social infrastructure, they still have the weapons, the fighters, and the command structure built over more than 40 years. So, When Washington asks Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah, it isn't asking one leader to sign an order and have an army obey it. It's asking a fragile state to forcibly dismantle a movement that is arguably more organized, more disciplined, and in many areas more trusted locally than the government itself. The Lebanese armed forces simply don't have the strength to do that. And if they tried, there's a very real historical risk that the army itself splits along sectarian lines, and Lebanon slides back into the kind of civil war it spent 15 brutal years clawing its way out of last century. That's the trap. I'd call it the mirror image of Camp David. In 1978, America needed to convince one man to make one decision. In 2026, America needs a fractured, exhausted state to forcibly disarm a movement embedded in its own government, using a national army too weak to even attempt it without risking the collapse of the country. Those are not the same problem, no matter how similar the paperwork looks. And I think Iran understood this the moment the framework was announced. Here's why that matters so much. Iran didn't need to send troops to protect this outcome. Iran didn't need to threaten anyone publicly. All Tehran had to do was sit back and let Hezbollah do what Hezbollah was always going to do anyway, which is refuse. One statement, one veto, no missiles required. And within days, the deal that was being celebrated in Washington as a historic turning point was already being described by Hezbollah's most powerful political ally, the Speaker of Lebanon's parliament, as something that could push the country to the edge of a new civil war. Think about how efficient that is as a strategy. The United States spent months building this framework, coordinating between 3 governments, drafting 14 points, staging a signing ceremony. Iran didn't have to lift a finger to expose the weakness in it. All it had to do was wait for Hezbollah to say no, because Hezbollah was always going to say no. That's not luck. That's Iran understanding the internal architecture of Lebanese politics better than the people who designed the deal. Now, at the exact same moment this was unfolding in Beirut, something else was happening. 2,000 kilometers away in the Strait of Hormuz. And I don't think it's a coincidence that both of these stories broke at the same time. Iran's chief negotiator, who also happens to be the Speaker of Iran's own parliament, announced that Iran had exported more than 40 million barrels of oil in under 2 weeks, right after the United States lifted its naval blockade. Independent shipping trackers put the real number even higher, closer to 50 million barrels. And remember, this is a country that just went through a direct war with the United States and Israel. Its nuclear facilities were struck. Its top leadership was hit. Inflation is running above 80%. These are real, serious wounds. I'm not pretending otherwise. But a wounded country that can move 50 million barrels of oil in 2 weeks is not a country that's out of options. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. The same negotiator who announced those oil numbers described the Strait of Hormuz not as an international shipping lane, not as a waterway governed by maritime law, but as what he called a divine gift and Iran's greatest instrument of power. Think about the boldness of that statement. The head of Iran's negotiating team, sitting in the same city as American envoys, calling one of the most important choke points on Earth his weapon. And it's not an exaggeration. Roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply moves through that strait every single day. Japan gets 3/4 of its imported energy through it. China gets around 40%. India gets around 60%. Japan's own prime minister has publicly said that if Hormuz closes, Japan's economy could collapse within 8 or 9 months. Iran has known the value of that geography for decades. What's different now is how openly they're using it. If you're finding this useful, this is exactly the kind of pattern recognition I try to bring to every video on this channel, connecting stories that look separate on the surface but are actually one strategy underneath. Drop a comment telling me which part of this surprised you the most, because I genuinely read them, and it helps me know what to dig into next. Iran isn't just exporting oil quietly and hoping nobody notices. They're pushing hard for mandatory fees on every ship passing through the strait. Not a voluntary service charge, not a maintenance contribution, mandatory. And that word choice is the whole story. A voluntary fee makes Iran a toll operator collecting money for a service. A mandatory fee makes Iran the sovereign authority over that waterway. And it forces the rest of the world to formally acknowledge that authority every time a ship passes through. Washington has pushed back hard on this, calling it a violation of international law. And technically, that's a fair legal argument. But legal arguments only matter if someone is willing and able to enforce them. And the same American Navy that just lifted a blockade because the political and military cost of sustaining it became too high is not exactly demonstrating the appetite for that kind of enforcement right now. So here's what I want you to see. 2 things are happening at once, in 2 different places, and they reinforce each other perfectly. In Beirut, Iran lets Hezbollah's political veto quietly dismantle a deal that was designed to remove Lebanon from its orbit. In Hormuz, Iran builds real, tangible financial and strategic leverage every single day. Leverage that doesn't disappear no matter what happens at the negotiating table in Doha. Two fronts, one coherent plan. And Washington's response to both of them has been to talk about deals and frameworks and diplomatic breakthroughs, while the actual facts on the ground move in the opposite direction. This is why Iran wouldn't sit face-to-face with the American envoys in Doha. It's tempting to read that as weakness, as if Iran is avoiding a confrontation it can't win. I think that gets it backwards entirely. Iran doesn't need to be in that room, because the room in Doha was never where this gets decided. The real contest is happening in Beirut, where Hezbollah's refusal is quietly strangling the trilateral framework, and in Hormuz, where Iran builds leverage with every tanker that passes through unchallenged. Staying out of the room isn't retreat. It's a signal that Iran believes the advantage is being built somewhere Washington isn't watching closely enough. Now, I want to be fair here, because I don't think it's honest analysis to only present one side. There's a real argument for why Washington might still come out ahead in all of this, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. The strongest version of that argument goes like this. The United States genuinely did serious damage to Iran in this war. Nuclear facilities were destroyed. The top leadership took real losses. The missile program was degraded. Inflation is crushing ordinary Iranians. From this angle, Washington isn't negotiating out of desperation, it's negotiating from a position of real strength. And eventually, no matter how much Iran postures in public, the economic pressure at home will force real concessions at the table. This is roughly the model the United States used with Iraq after 1991. Sustained pressure combined with sanctions, eventually forcing compliance. It's a coherent argument, and it's not built on nothing. But here's what that argument struggles to explain. Iran endured decades of sanctions before this war even started, and it still had an active nuclear program the day the war began, even under a full naval blockade. The moment that blockade lifted, Iran moved 50 million barrels of oil in 2 weeks. That is not the behavior of a country that has run out of room to maneuver. And there's one variable in this equation that simply didn't exist the last time America tried this kind of pressure campaign at this scale. China and Russia. Back in the early 1990s, the United States was effectively the only power on earth capable of offering a country like Iraq or Iran a genuine path back into the global economy, access to capital, technology, trade. That monopoly is gone now. China is buying Iranian oil through shipping paperwork that quietly lists no country of origin at all. Russia is supplying military technology and blocking serious action against Tehran at the UN Security Council. Neither of them is doing this out of loyalty to Iran. They're doing it because if American pressure is allowed to fully collapse a country that defies Washington, it sends a message to every government in their own orbit that defiance carries no safety net whatsoever. That is a message neither Beijing nor Moscow can afford to let stand unchallenged. So when you have two major world powers quietly providing economic insulation to Tehran, the American pressure campaign runs into a ceiling. The leverage is real, but in a world with more than one center of power, it's no longer enough on its own to force total capitulation, the way it might have 30 years ago. There's one more layer to this that I think almost nobody is talking about clearly enough, and it's the piece that determines what the next year actually looks like. A lot of serious, thoughtful analysts have looked at this war and concluded that Iran's broader network of allied groups, sometimes called the axis of resistance, has been badly weakened. Hezbollah took real losses. The Houthis showed limits. Armed factions in Iraq didn't escalate the way some expected. On the surface, that reads as a network in decline, and I think that read is defensible as far as it goes. But I think it makes one critical mistake. It treats weakened and finished as the same thing, and they are not the same thing at all. Picture an octopus, cut off one of its arms, and it doesn't die. It survives, and in some species it can even regrow the limb. But here's the part people miss. While that's happening, the remaining arms don't sit still waiting for orders. They start operating more independently, adapting to local conditions, becoming genuinely harder to predict and harder to target, precisely because they're no longer moving as one tightly coordinated body. That's a fair description of what's happening across this network right now. During the war itself, notice what didn't happen. Hezbollah didn't open every front available to it. The Houthis calibrated carefully rather than escalating freely. Armed groups in Iraq stayed largely contained. Why? Because each of these groups is now operating according to its own local reality, not simply waiting for instructions from Tehran. Hezbollah is currently fighting for its own political survival inside Lebanon, under pressure from this disarmament framework and from rival Lebanese factions who see this moment as their best chance to permanently reduce its power. Opening a massive new front right now would be a strategic gift to Hezbollah's domestic rivals, not a show of strength. The Houthis are managing their own balancing act, projecting just enough deterrence without inviting a response big enough to threaten their survival. Groups in Iraq are embedded in the formal Iraqi state itself, with parliamentary seats and budget lines of their own. giving them strong incentives to favor stability over open war. What that tells us is that this network isn't dissolving, it's transforming, moving away from a centralized structure where Tehran coordinates large synchronized moves toward a decentralized web where each piece adapts on its own to its own local conditions. And here's the part I think Washington keeps underestimating. A decentralized, locally rooted network is actually harder to dismantle than a centralized one, not easier. To defeat the old structure, you needed to cut the lines running back to Tehran. To defeat the new one, you have to fight each piece separately, inside separate countries, under separate legal and political rules, each with its own steep political cost. That's exactly why Hezbollah's refusal to disarm isn't just a dispute about weapons sitting in southern Lebanon. It's a preview of what this entire network looks like going forward. More scattered, more locally rooted, and in a strange way, more resilient than it was before this war ever started. Because before the war, you could frame Hezbollah as an extension of Iranian foreign policy from the outside. After the war, anyone trying to move against Hezbollah has to confront it as a domestic political actor inside a sovereign country, with all the legal and diplomatic complications that comes with. Iran has spent more than 30 years building this system. They understand exactly how much more durable the decentralized version is compared to the one that existed before the first missile was fired. Before I bring all of this together, I want to say something, honestly. I don't think anyone, including me, has this entire situation figured out with certainty. These are frameworks for understanding a moving, uncertain situation, not predictions carved in stone. I could be wrong about pieces of this, maybe even large pieces. But what I'm confident about is that the version of this story being repeated across most major outlets, the idea that America has simply won this outright and Iran is cornered and out of moves, is missing real structural pressures that don't just vanish because a military campaign looked impressive on paper. So here's what I genuinely watch over the coming weeks if you want to see where this actually goes. Watch whether the United States releases any portion of the roughly $6 billion in frozen Iranian assets, because Iran's negotiators have been explicit that this isn't just a talking point, it's treated as a precondition for serious engagement. Watch whether Lebanon's own army actually attempts to move into the designated zones in the south and take control from Israeli forces, because if Hezbollah blocks that movement, which its own public statements strongly suggest it will, the entire framework is effectively dead before it ever really started. And watch China's continued silence on Iran's mandatory fee proposal for the Strait of Hormuz, because China depends on that waterway more than almost any other country on Earth. And its refusal to publicly object to Iran's plan is not neutral. Silence from a power that sighs is a message all on its own, aimed at both Tehran and Washington simultaneously. Before we wrap up, if this kind of deep, connected analysis is something you want more of, make sure you're subscribed and share this with one person who keeps asking you what's actually going on in the Middle East right now, because this is exactly the conversation they need to hear. So let's come back to where we started. Washington built a deal modeled on one of the most successful diplomatic achievements of the last century, and assumed the same formula would produce the same result nearly 50 years later. But Egypt in 1978 and Lebanon in 2026 are not the same kind of country facing the same kind of problem. One had a single leader with full command of a national army. The other has a movement so deeply woven into its politics, its hospitals, its schools, and its communities that removing it by force risks tearing the entire country apart. Iran didn't need to fire a single shot to expose that gap. All it had to do was let Hezbollah be Hezbollah, while quietly building leverage in the waters of Hormuz that no signature in Washington can undo. The real question was never whether Lebanon would sign a piece of paper. It's whether anyone actually has the power to make that paper mean something once the ink dries. And right now, the answer to that question is being written not in Washington, but in Beirut. And in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, one tanker, one veto, one refusal at a time. If you made it this far, you clearly care about understanding this properly instead of just watching headlines scroll by. That already puts you ahead of most people following this story. I'll see you in the next one.